Well, thank you all for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Sekiya-san, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to say, too, congratulations to the Japan Society on their 110th anniversary. This is really something. So I'm very pleased tonight to introduce our speakers, Professor Pamela D. Winfield, and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Elon University, and Professor Steven Heine, Professor and Director of Asian Studies at Florida International University. Professor Winfield is the author of Icons and Iconoclasm in Japanese Buddhism, Kukai and Dogen on the Art of Enlightenment, which won the book prize from the Association of Asian Studies Southeast Conference in 2015. Professor Heine has published over 30 books and 100 articles on various aspects of Japanese religion and society, and is a recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun Medal from the government of Japan. They are both co-editors of the recently published book, Zen and Material Culture. And we are very pleased to have them here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Winfield and Professor Heine to the stage.
Thank you so much, Professor Ozeki, and thank you to Sekiya-san. It's lovely to be back. I took Japanese classes here many years ago, and I never dreamed that I would be giving a talk here tonight. So thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming and supporting this vital cultural institution with your presence and your attention here tonight. So my task here tonight is to speak for about 20 minutes about Zen art and visual culture, which will draw primarily from my first book on icons and iconoclasm, shown here on your left. And I'd like to organize my remarks into two main parts. First, I'd like to talk about Zen's reputation for iconoclasm, that is, the rejection or even the destruction of images. And then in the second half of the talk, I'd like to call that anti-image reputation into question by looking closely at some of Zen Master Dogen's 13th century images. And then Dr. Heine will discuss the many material objects involved in Zen monastic practice by drawing from our recent co-edited volume on Zen and Material Culture here. Both of these books were published by Oxford University Press, thanks to our wonderful editor, Cynthia Reed, who is here tonight. So thank you, Cynthia. I hope that our joint lecture here tonight and lively conversation with Professor Ozeki will inform you of the latest scholarship on Japanese Buddhism, art history, and material culture studies, and that it will enhance our appreciation of Zen art and artifacts, both then and now. So to begin, what is Zen? I know we all have ideas and impressions of Zen that we've received from popular culture, but Bodhidharma's famous four-line verse simply defines it as a special transmission beyond the scriptures, not relying on words or letters, that points directly to the mind, that sees one's own nature and becomes, so that one can become a Buddha. So we're going to be talking tonight a lot about this mind-to-mind transmission, right? This idea that each generation of Zen masters can share and pass on the Enlightenment experience to the next. And we're going to consider how that very intangible and ineffable idea gets visualized and communicated in very concrete form. Now, the problem of rendering visible that which is invisible and the subsequent pitfall of fetishizing those forms of faith explains why many religions throughout the world at one point or another have tried to destroy or deconstruct images of the absolute. In the case of Zen Buddhism, refreshingly, humor and satirical images have been used to deconstruct Zen of its own sense of self-importance, right? Since humor automatically deflates one's aggrandized sense of image of enlightenment. Even Zen's first founding patriarch, right? Zen's first founding patriarch, the great Bodhidharma, gets parodied with cartoon-like hyperbole. His bulging eyes, furrowed unibrow, flaring nostrils, facial hair, long lobed ears, and body hair all make fun of his Indian features and his irascible demeanor. Its sixth patriarch, Huineng, gets hacked and chopped up with cutting brushstrokes, just like the Buddhist scriptures he is shredding. The Zen eccentrics, Hanshan, Kazan, and his buddy Jitoku get a bit loopy-goofy when gazing up at the full moon and writing poetry together about this stock symbol of enlightenment. And Ito Jakuchu's 18th century vegetable nirvana on the right riffs on Koyasan's famous 11th century final nirvana of the Buddha on the left. His reclining golden body gets reconfigured on the right into a big white Japanese radish root, or daikon, right? Tanka Tenin burned a wooden statue to warm up his backside, and when his master scolds him, he says, "I'm just trying to get some relics of the Buddha." And his master explodes, "You can't get relics from just a piece of wood." And so Tanka responds, "Well, then if it's just a piece of wood, then why are you scolding me?" And in another version of the story, he asks, "So then can I have another Buddha to burn?" Right? All of these comic images and quirky Zen antics and even scatological narratives, which I'm kind of glossing over here, were designed to bring elevated notions of Buddhahood down into the lived body, right? They taught us that Buddhahood cannot be envisioned, only experienced in and as the physical forms of the world. That's why a famous Rinzai Zen koan admonishes, when you see the Buddha, kill him. When you see the patriarch, kill him. This kind of anti-imagistic, anti-conceptualism of munen, muso, that is no thought, no image, is designed to empty the mind of any preconceived attachments to obtaining enlightenment, precisely so that one can, in fact, realize emptiness and obtain enlightenment. Paradoxically, it's when you let go of it that you get it. So this kind of anti-establishment discourse explains and justifies Zen's well-established reputation for anti-scholasticism, minimalism, and iconoclasm. But as you may have observed, as you may have noticed, this tradition gets paradoxically depicted in voluminous writings and paintings throughout history. So what I'd like to do today is to deconstruct, or at least nuance further, this stereotype for radical Zen iconoclasm. So Zen Iconoclasm Reconsidered, what's wrong with this picture, recognizes that there is a problem with imagery in Zen, but also there's a problem with seeing the tradition only in this way. So let's look at Dogen, right, and consider his take on the art of enlightenment. Does he think that art can represent or re-presence the experience of awakening or not? The answer is sometimes no, but also sometimes yes. Right? An example of his negative view is his experience viewing a painting of Nagarjuna while in full moon meditation, but Dogen's positive appraisals of Zen transmission certificates called Shisho and master portraits called Chinzo demonstrate the esteem in which Dogen held some Zen images, especially those pertaining to this special transmission. So first, let's consider Dogen's anti-image writings. In his fascicle on Buddha nature, Dogen relates his visit to Mount Ayuwangshan in China as a study abroad student in 1223. There he sees paintings of the 33 Zen masters of India and China painted on the western corridor of the main hall of Guangli Temple. You can kind of see the corridor there with lots of portraits painted on the wall. Among the 33 figures was an illustration of the episode when the Indian master Nagarjuna manifested a full moon body, that is, a fully enlightened body of absolute freedom while in meditation. Dogen asks his guide about it when he returns to the monastery in 1225, and the guide explains that it's Nagarjuna's bodily manifestation of the round moon shape. But Dogen doesn't buy it. He says the monk answered him with no true breath, and only empty words, without any deep experiential understanding. And so Dogen prods him further with that powerful Zen sense of parody and quips that the painted white circle on the wall, well, it's just like a painted rice cake, isn't it? And the monk laughs, but Dogen says there was no Zen edge to it. Dogen's crack about the painting resembling a rice cake was not itself cracked by the monk's laugh. So in Dogen's mind, his Chinese guide failed the standard test of witty Zen repartee and one-upmanship. And according to this Edo period illustration of this episode in a biography called the Kenzeki, this encounter at Ayuwangshan fundamentally changed Dogen's views, right? On the side reading down it says, Daiai wa mikata o kawaeru. So his outlook, his view, mikata, was changed. Now, it's important to consider that Dogen may be posturing a bit here to cast himself as superior even to the esteemed monks of China. He's writing about his incident while in institution building mode back in Japan, and he needs to present himself as a bona fide enlightened master. But his critique is equally unsparing to artists as well. Dogen laments that Chinese artists have objectified this famous episode of meditation without any true experiential realization. He says they paint it on the monastery walls, but they don't paint it in their bodies or minds. In Dogen's estimation, they mistake simile for reality, the map for the territory, and the menu for the meal. Those images are just fingers pointing to the moon, like Kanzan and Jitoku that I showed you earlier, not the moon itself. Consequently, Dogen concludes that things that are undepictable would be best left unpainted, since for Dogen, realization is a dynamic experience to be undergone, not trivialized or fixed on by a white circle on some Chinese temple wall. For this reason, Dogen urges us all, old Buddhas, new Buddhas, encounter the real manifesting body. Don't waste your time admiring a painted rice cake, vainly tracing pictures of rice cakes. What's the use in that? Okay. Now, in contrast to the Buddhist patriarch's white circle on the wall, Dogen definitely valued this circular image of all the patriarchs' names, which radiate out and around from the historical Shakyamuni Buddha in the center. It's known as Dogen's Shisho, or Certificate of Dharma Transmission, from his Chinese master Ru Jing. Dogen's name is inserted into the circle at the bottom center, right after Ru Jing's name to his right. Now, a thin red line symbolizing the bloodline of the Zen monastic family originates with Buddha in the center, goes down to his first Dharma heir, Mahakashapa, below, then weaves in and out among each and every patriarch name throughout history, including Dogen's name down at the bottom, and then reconnects up with Buddha's original mind in the center. The inscription says, just as the lifeblood passes through the Buddhas and patriarchs of this certificate, so too does it pass through Dogen. And then it's signed and dated 1227 by his master Ru Jing. Describing the circular format of his Enlightenment diploma, Dogen says that all of these patriarchs lie shoulder to shoulder with one another, right? Can you see how they're kind of shoulder to shoulder, right? And so despite Dogen's iconoclastic rhetoric at times, he nevertheless valorizes these particular kinds of Zen images as icons. This underscores the importance of visual culture in Dogen's thought. These sorts of icons are to be recognized and revered as fixing the ineffable Dharma transmission in graphic form. And Dogen actually goes looking for other Shisho certificates in China, and he's actually overcome with gratitude and a sense of mystical synchronicity for being able to see and participate in their timeless mind-to-mind transmission. Finally, like the Shisho transmission certificate, Dogen valued other images as proof of his succession. This is the master portrait, or Chinzo, of his master Ru Jing that adherents believe Dogen brought back to Japan in 1227. This is called an isuzo, or seated portrait, depicting Ru Jing sitting in his abbot's chair in three-quarter profile view facing to the right. Now, this is a standard pictorial convention that suggests that it was a living portrait and not completed posthumously, although art historians love to debate this point because there's a later Yuan dynasty source that says this convention is nonsense, but I leave it to the art historians. In any case, in the upper third of the hanging scroll, we see the dedication inscription, or san. Zen art historian Helmut Brinker says, quote, in the case of contemporaneous portraits, they were composed and written by the depicted master himself, a ji-san, self-inscription, usually upon the request of disciples, confrères, lay adherents, or patrons, end quote. Now, in his writings, Dogen rails against monks who display such images without awakening. He denigrates them as absolutely worthless, since it was such a common practice at the time to exchange portraits, master portraits, for a lay donation. It was kind of a cottage industry at the time. By contrast, Dogen writes very clearly that he awakened under his master pictured here, and Soto scholars maintain that this portrait was one of the handful of items that Dogen brought back with him to Japan. So let's take a closer look at the inscription above and notice how the interplay of image and text both substantiate but also subverts this image of authenticity. This is what I like to call visual mimesis, but textual nemesis or nemesis. Rujing writes, uninterrupted sitting lasts as long as heaven and earth and reveals the golden body. This is what distinguished my master. But what should a monk look like? A Chinese watermelon? An eggplant? A bottle gourd? Even funnier, Vajra monk hanging upside down from a plum tree. Written in earnest, the disciple Jechen of Mount Taipai. So now in this verse, Rujing opens with a poetic line expressing the eternity of practice which produces golden-bodied masters, such as the reclining Buddha that I showed you earlier. But then Rujing immediately questions this lofty golden ideal and his own likeness in this portrait and rhetorically asks what a monk should really look like. He crashes from the sacred to the profane in a single line by suggesting that his bald, shiny, shaven head might resemble a melon or a gourd or an eggplant in the market, somewhat like Ito Jakushu's vegetable nirvana scene that I showed earlier. Rujing concludes his self-deprecating verse by imagining an even more hilarious scene, a plum tree that yields a monk head-like fruit dangling down from on high. The plum tree was a Chinese substitute for Buddha's Bodhi tree of enlightenment. So this line obliquely suggests that Rujing has obtained the full fruit of enlightenment, but he imagines himself hanging upside down without any ideals about lofty enlightenment, but with his gaze set firmly down on the ground. In typical Zen style, therefore, Rujing's text follows the threefold sequence that presents him as a golden-bodied Zen master, negates him as a self-deprecating eggplant head, and then represents him as enlightened precisely because he is so down-to-earth and funny. As a result, his combination of formal image and amusing text validates, yet also undercuts the image of enlightenment, overturns conventional expectations, and relegates the sublime to the realm of the humble squash. In light of such parody and satire, the treachery of the image, as Magritte calls it, doesn't stand a chance. No wonder Dogen held the portrait of his master in such high esteem. So, to conclude, why is the representation of Nagarjuna's meditation inauthentic, but the Shisho certificate a manifestation of the way of the Buddhas? Why does a picture of a full moon constitute nothing but a rice cake, but a picture of a master constitute a trace of enlightenment? I'd like to suggest a few keys to unpacking Dogen's take on the art of enlightenment. First, some images just are icons. There just are some special Zen things that are worthy of veneration and respect for Dogen. Like the robe or the alms bowl, the Shisho transmission certificate was a seal or an emblem that condensed the immaterial form of mind-to-mind Dharma transmission in material graphic form. And as for Chinzo portraits, Dogen is happy to let the image of the master stand as long as the self-deprecating text is there to remind the spectator not to overly idolize him. So Dogen's iconoclasm was not a wholesale one, but rather a selective and a qualified one. Oops. Second, it depends on Dogen's intent or agenda. Dogen's most anti-imagistic stance occurs when he actually has an ulterior motive. The Nagarjuna episode is not really even about the imagery per se. It's really about demonstrating his superiority to Chinese monks and artists. And because Dogen lays claim to the true Dharma eye, that is, the namesake of his life's work, the Shobogenzo, he's really claiming the authority to establish a new kind of Zen temple in Japan. Third, it depends on the audience. When speaking to his monks, Dogen severely criticized the peddling of Buddhist images for lay donations and insists that these Zen icons should be obtained and viewed in the correct Zen spirit, which can only be achieved through meditative experience. But when speaking to beginners, for example, in his Zui Monkey talks, Dogen endorses the veneration of even crude, badly rendered Buddhist images because it is beneficial for novices to reverence the three jewels, that is, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, or Buddhist community. So the level of his audience and the level from which Dogen is speaking also shapes his view on imagery. Fourth, be flexible. No hard and fast rule should be mandated about either revering or destroying images. It's necessary to adapt to circumstances. This is known as upaya, or expedient means, in Mahayana Buddhism. In his Zui Monkey Talks, Dogen approves of iconoclasm as an expedient means to furthering the Buddha way. He even justifies Thangka Tenen's burning of the Buddha by saying, remember to warm up his butt, by saying he must have done it for a reason. Although, quote, although it appears to be an evil act, it was meant to emphasize a point in his teaching, Dogen says, end quote. And Dogen approves of Eisai's, another Zen master's, decision to give some copper from the Buddha's halo to a poor man in exchange for food, even though it's technically a crime to make personal use of what belongs to a Buddha. So as a result, no definitive rule for images can be fixed for all time and circumstance for Dogen. It's for this reason that, at least in the case of Dogen, if not for many other Zen masters, Zen's reputation for wholesale iconoclasm and icon-bashing antics needs to be reevaluated and significantly revised. So thank you for your attention during the visual culture portion of the talk. Now I'd like my co-editor, Steven Heine, to come up, and he'll speak on the more material side of Japanese Zen. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks to Pamela and Ruth Ozeki for the introductions, and it's great to be at the Japan Society tonight. My goal is to talk about my paper in the book, and also briefly sum up a couple of the other articles. And my topic had to do with the sticks, staffs, rods, canes, fly whisks, other long, slender objects that became a key feature of Zen Buddhism, especially as it transferred from China to Japan in the 13th and 14th centuries. There was a famous story back in medieval Japan, or a motif that was repeated in many stories in the early days of Zen in medieval Japan. This is where he hung up his traveling staff. And there's a lot packed into those few words. First of all, he hung up the staff. That means that he finally came to rest at a certain temple after traveling for 5, 10, 15 years of itinerancy looking for the right teacher. That monk who had been a hermit, who had lived in the woods, in the forest, and got the staff by being a forest monk and picking up a stick in nature and using that as a symbol of his authenticity, eventually makes his rounds and comes to settle in at a temple. After he hangs up his staff there, then he may train for another 5, 10, 15 years before he becomes a master and eventually takes over the temple or a similar temple, and that staff, which was a symbol of the authenticity of being a recluse, leaving society behind, now becomes a symbol of authority as the new master takes charge of a large institution of running a Zen temple. So one thing about the material objects is that they represent the authenticity and the authority. And the authority in Zen, ideally, and other religious traditions, stems from the authentic realization and behavioral modes of the master. But, so ideally, they reinforce one another, but that's not always the case, and sometimes they're at opposition. And I think there's a reason there's a variety of staffs and sticks and fly whisks and canes in Zen is because they're trying to capture both sides, and one side is more accentuated than the other. So when we look at the variety of staffs, some are ornamental, some have jewelry, some are made out of metal, and they have finery and elegance about them, and they recall imperial or regal objects that were used in the realm, whereas others are raw, natural, and are not shaped by human civilization so much, and that, to me, represents more the authenticity. I want to mention briefly another side of introducing material objects into our studies of Zen and also into the history of Zen as it came from China to Japan. So there's a saying, or there's actually a real story that in the early days of Zen in Japan, when they were introducing all these Chinese objects, robes and beads and bells and staffs that the Japanese Buddhists weren't familiar with and kind of went against the grain of the native styles that they had developed for several centuries, the monks were complaining about the new Zen temple in Kyoto. At that point, there was only one Zen temple, really, in Japan, in Kyoto. And they were complaining about it, and they said, when those monks walk down the street, they're wearing these Chinese-style robes with these big sleeves that are billowing. And they said, it makes a wind, it affects you as you're going by, and you can barely get down the street because they're taking up so much room with their billowing sleeves. And that was, they wanted the government to outlaw those kinds of objects. And those objects were foreign, they were weird. A few years later, by 50 years later, they became the most sought-after exotic continental objects, and the Japanese were flocking to China. At first, there were just a couple of pilgrims like Dogen and Eisai, as Pamela mentioned. But eventually, there was a whole stream of people, and there was a whole industry in China developed in the port city outside of what's now Shanghai to cultivate this business, because it becomes a commercial enterprise, because a lot of the Japanese were sincere monks, but some of them were more tourists or lay pilgrims who just wanted to accumulate some objects and regalia that they would find in China. Okay, so I think one thing with the staffs is that they become objects to teach. And the material objects in Zen, ideally, whether they're authentic or authoritarian, are weapons of mass instruction, as I like to say. And then there's a variety of these, because we'll see that other articles in the book deal with rags, bowls, robes, rosary beads, and all of these are material objects, but we know about them, at least traditionally, because of the rhetorical imagery. We read about them in text. We see the inscriptions of the poetry on the beautiful paintings, and a lot of times those poems and paintings are designed to kind of poke fun and not take it all too seriously, because then you're putting it on a pedestal and you're idealizing it. And of course, we see a lot of these themes carried out in rituals over the centuries and still carried out today. And a lot of people say, well, if they're still being done today, can they really be authentic to what happened nearly 1,000 years ago? And there's a saying in Japan what's called stick reading. Stick reading means that when you recite these ancient rituals and you're so stiff, because it's just rote learning at this point, that you seem like a stick. And so the stick now becomes something negative. It's not authoritarian or authentic. It's inauthentic in a way. So you have to take that into account as well. Now, one thing, for those of you who may have visited the Ueno Asakusa district in Tokyo, there's a famous street called Inaricho that goes in between those two big public centers, Ueno and Asakusa, where there's over 50 Buddhist stores selling implements of various kinds. And some of the stores have 5 or 6 stories in them, because there's one story devoted to each of the sects, and you can see one of those stores. And they have a wide variety of implements, objects, paraphernalia that people are looking for, because this is part of a kind of ancestor worship in Japan, where the Buddhist rituals serve the purpose of commemorating the deceased ancestors, and people are trying to accumulate some of these objects for their home in order to petition the ancestors for favor. But that's the popular religion today. Let's go back to some of the traditional images. And we have the Zen master holding the walking staff or the traveling staff and the fly whisk. 2 very different objects. You don't always see this together in the same image, but why does he need to hold both? He's only got 2 hands. He's using them up for these sticks or staffs or slender objects. And, this shows the importance. This was actually a Chinese monk who had come to Japan a few centuries later, reintroducing some of the Chinese styles. And to me, the reason he's kind of two-fisted there is to emphasize, don't forget the origins of these objects. They come from China, and since I'm from the continent, it's more authentic in my hands. The middle object shows one of the famous Zen parodies. They said, here's a staff, tell me what this is without calling it a staff and without not calling it a staff. So typical Zen story is to create that double bind where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And what do? Well, you could break the stick in half. You could hit somebody with the stick. And that may be completely right, or it may be completely wrong, depending on how you're evaluated. As Pamela indicated, the evaluations are very subjective with these things, because are you really authentic, or are you faking the authenticity? It's very hard to tell. Only a master can tell. The last image is a shop that is set up in the basement of a temple, where the priests from that sect are going to buy the fly whisks. And they cultivate the finest hair on the fly whisks, and there's a lot of price ranges and a lot of specialization that goes into producing these, so that they have just the right touch for the Zen priest to buy today. This image was created for me by Kaz Tanahashi, a famous translator and calligrapher of Zen, and I just asked him to do simple drawings of 5 kinds of staffs. So we can see on the one hand there is the staff with rings on it. That's usually bronze or silver, and the rings are there to partly to make a sound, to alert living beings that somebody's walking by, so that the ants can scatter and not get stepped on. And partly it has that quality because it has the regal imagery to it. There's the hitting staff, of course, that's very famous on the middle bottom part. The flat staff, which is used to scold the monks that are slumbering during the prolonged meditation sessions. There's a 3-foot cane, and the walking staff that I've been describing has to be taller than the person. So that's usually going to be 6 or 7 feet. And the symbolism is that the staff kind of is superior to the human element, and that shows the importance of the materiality. Now, as you might guess here, I took a trip recently to Jerusalem, and I actually called my article, "Thy Rod and Thy Staff, They Discomfort Me," drawing on the biblical parallel. And it's kind of interesting how it works in the traditions. I won't go into all the details, but the staffs are supposed to discomfort in Zen, and I think the biblical parallel is a little bit similar. But I also want to show this object because we can see the role of hats, the role of horns. All traditions have their material objects. Zen didn't invent them, but we think of Zen as minimalistic and iconoclastic and not relying on these objects. And so our Pamela and I project is to kind of rethink that process and show that that all religious traditions are moving in this or have moved in this direction. The do's and don'ts of the Zen staff. Well, the staff is a very important object, maybe the most important object in the weaponry, so to speak, of the Zen master's teaching, because it can be used in so many diverse ways, and it's so personally symbolic of the master's own accomplishments. And it has a certain etiquette and procedures. There's descriptions of what you can do and what you can't do. What you don't do is just lay the staff down on the ground casually. So along come the Zen crazies. Pamela had a slide with a couple of them pointing up to the moon, and they put the staff down on the ground. That's a taboo thing, but that they want to flaunt tradition and show that conventions can be violated. What do you do with the staff? Well, the reprimanding is the most famous example. And Dogen himself was supposed to have become enlightened when he heard his master scold the monk sitting next to him who was falling asleep during meditation. And the light bulb went off in Dogen's mind that you have to commit yourself to constant practice. So if you look at that story, what's important? Is it the staff itself that was just an implement or an instrument to create a realization, or is it the realization? Obviously, the realization is probably takes priority, but could it have happened without the object causing it? In the other slide, the other image, the staff is used by a recluse to to celebrate nature apart from humanity. Here are some modern examples to show that the staff has been used over the centuries, from the Edo period to the contemporary world. And it's a very prized object at auctions and let alone archival studies, but it's a very prized object to see some of these old staffs with the inscriptions and with the calligraphy that they were given. Here's a couple of examples of Zen sayings celebrating the importance of the staff. And to read the bottom one: for those who understand the walking staff, grass sandals are all that is needed. And the line above, whoever understands thoroughly the Zen staff concludes his journeys in pursuit of the Dharma. So you can reduce the Zen teaching to one object, one word. But there are going to be other examples besides the staff. Staff's not going to be the only one. I don't want to claim priority for the staff. But the idea is, if you do that one thing well, if everything is invested in fulfilling the authentic and sense of authority in the use of that one object, that can be sufficient. If we look at the bottom passage here, this is one of my favorite lines from a poem about the staff. It guides one home to their village that is lit up by the moon. So the staff takes on a kind of philosophical or metaphysical significance at that point. And at the top passage, the staff should be taken as the essential world, which is the zero infinite, which is nothing else but our own essential nature. And that's very similar to Dogen looking at the image of the clear moon. Okay, there's other objects that are discussed in the book. Michaela Ross talks about the importance of rosary beads. And rosary beads have played an important role in other Zen sects as well, and came to Japan from the continent. And there's different sizes and shapes, sometimes different numbers of beads. 108, of course, is a famous auspicious number often used in Buddhism. But she shows that in medieval times, the rosary beads were not just simply objects, but had symbolism connected with each and every bead. So this is a very interesting image capturing a handwritten medieval manuscript that shows that how the beads were analyzed for their significance, and that would be something that would be memorized, and then those slips of paper where this idea was inscribed would be passed on. And a lot of those calligraphies were lost for a time and had been rediscovered by modern researchers. Paula Arai is the next author who talks about Zen rags. And she's done a lot of field work with Zen nuns today. And they want to make use of every single object. Nothing is wasted. No time is wasted, and no object can be wasted. So rags are also invested with the Buddha nature. But the rag is not just an object as a means to an end. The rag is something that you can write the sutras on. You can imbue it with all kinds of metaphysical significance. And then Paula came up with a diagram. It's maybe a little hard to see that image, but basically she's saying that if we look at the use of the rag, we can see that it's an object. It can be an instrument, but it's also metaphysical. And the point is that it is soteriological. That is, it embodies the enlightenment of the practitioner. So even the most menial, seemingly trivial object is invested with that symbolism. Another of our authors, Greg Levine, takes a different view on the material objects, and he's a little bit skeptical of the way they've been transferred to modern America. And he's a little concerned about the commodification of the Zen objects as these cultural transfers take place. I think the cultural transfer of Zen to America has to be looked in the perspective of the history of China to Japan, and then from different parts of China, and then throughout Japan over the centuries, eventually coming to the West. And the fact that there are so many objects now available through internet purchase or other easy ways of acquiring them can be a source of great comfort and delight to those people who seek that out. But Greg Levine's point is that that's where materialistic approaches can set in and kind of violate the spirit of the original intention. And then to conclude, we have Morgan Patelka, who looked at the tea bowl. And I think after all is said and done, sometimes a bowl is simply a bowl, and not much else we can say about it. But I will make one final comment that Pamela and I had been talking about this, I think, since around 2002, about 15 years ago. And partly we weren't ready to do the project, and partly we didn't see so many colleagues interested in this particular topic. But the field of material cultural and visual culture in religious traditions and other cultural traditions has grown tremendously over these last 15 years, so we were ready to go. However, there were many objects that we couldn't simply include in this one volume. Bells were another important object, for example. Gardens, we ran out of room and weren't able to include that, and we had a whole list of other objects. So hopefully this field will continue to be studied. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. You know, as a novice Zen priest to whom Zen matters, these matters of Zen are, you know, very, very interesting to me. And I'm fascinated with the way that you're looking at, you know, what we've inherited as Zen in, you know, here in the West, and the you know, really tracing the way that Zen has migrated from China through Japan and now to the West. And while I was reading your book, I did a little research. I looked at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office website, and I learned that there are 947 live trademarks in the U.S. containing the word Zen.
Oh,
okay.
great.
Including things like Zen Payroll, Zen Desk, Zenefits, Zen Deals, Zen Folio, Zen Cash, Zen Riot, Zen Girlfriend, Zen Search Engine Optimization. And my favorite one is Zen Master Resin and Odor Eliminator Pipe and Hookah Smoke Cleaner.
Good research.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow.
And then I looked on Amazon, and then there are the books, you know, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, right. Zen and the Art of Quilting, Zen and the Art of Stand-Up Comedy, Zen and the Art of Snowplow Maintenance, Zen and the Art of Contemplative Eating, and this is my favorite here, Zen and the Art of Articulating Dolls Using Ball Joints. So I guess my question here is, you know, one of Dogen's points is that insentient beings, objects, right, can speak the Dharma, right? And so what happens when the language that these objects are speaking, what happens when it changes? Or to put it another way, can articulated dolls with ball joints, what kind of Dharma are they speaking? You know, what's the future here? And I guess
does it cry? Does it?
And I guess too, relating it back to you know, to the way that Zen, you know, I'm joking around here, but the way that Zen, you know, has changed its flavor so much as it moves from culture to culture.
Right.
Well, I have a Zen koan app on my phone, so I check that every day to see how the day's going to go. And if there were 947, that was a couple days ago, right? So probably we're up to 1,000. Yeah. It's like the stock market; it keeps getting higher. But you know, I think actually Dogen has a number of interesting concepts. One of them is entangled vines, and another is the what could be translated as making the right mistake. And so, you know, Dogen himself was accused of not really knowing Chinese and kind of mishearing it or misreading it or, you know, confusing. And out of that confusion, he would argue, comes the truth. Whether he deliberately changed the Chinese that he read or not. Now, like when Zen comes, you know, we want a certain reliability. We want the authenticity. We want to know it's the real thing. but it's never going to be that real thing, and maybe that real thing never really existed. So I think one thing is that Zen gives a rationale for how these changes themselves can be a creative process, and that the teaching should be relevant to the times.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to
I
respond to
was
that?
just thinking that, when Zen comes to mean everything, so it means nothing anymore, right? I get Groupons, find your Zen, and it's, massage, or it could be anything. And it's funny, but it's also perhaps part of the zeitgeist of cultural appropriation, right? And so that is absolutely, I do have a problem with the commercialized portion of this, and I think Greg Levine's article in our book speaks to that fine line between materiality and materialism, right? And how, for example, in his study, how an American Zen monastery is treading that fine line in their direct marketing techniques of Zen products by and for a nonprofit organization. So it's a fine line, and I think they're probably trying to do it mindful consumption as perhaps as best they can. The other side of the counter argument to your extreme examples is to point out that we have, I think, an ideal that somehow religion should be separate from finances, right? And as if these two worlds, as if this institution, like any political or military or educational institution, somehow doesn't depend on material resources. They always have and always will, right? So obviously, Dogen engages in fundraising campaigns. Zen monasteries need to do something to maintain the monastery, right? So it's a fine line, but let's not separate them completely. They're overlapping kind of Zen Venn diagrams. Zen Venn diagrams. That's right.
948.
Yeah.
If you get a copyright for it.
Well, that actually is very interesting because that made me think about the article by, I've forgotten,
Diane Riggs.
Diane Rigg,
About
the
robes.
gold robes versus the rag robes.
Great.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Steve, do you want to go with that?
Yes.
first? Okay.
Again, I think we see that variety. I think the robes is a great example, and Diane's done incredible research on that over the years. I see a little bit of it with the staffs as well. The imperial versus the antithesis of that, whatever the best word for that would be, but something natural, something primitive, something unrefined. And there's kind of, I think if you look at the Chinese influence, there's the Confucian hierarchical model, and then there's the Taoist naturalistic model, and those are both playing off one another. So what choice do you make? And Dogen has a very long passage on that inspired Diane's research, I think, on, does the gold robe that imitates what a king would wear. Buddha was conceived of as a king in some representations, but he was a hermit and a recluse and an ascetic in other interpretations. So how do they contradict one another? For Dogen, there's never going to be contradictions in the end, or their contradictions are going to be so embedded in anything that we say that he's able to affirm them.
It's an interesting, the issue of robes is interesting to me because as a novice Zen priest who is trying to understand how to practice Zen as an ordained person in the West, one of the, we have a kind of joke, which is that Zen is a clothing cult. Because Zen priests are always talking about clothes, right? And but the other thing, but it's also very beautiful. One of the traditions that was brought from Japan to the West was the tradition of sewing the okesa, sewing the Buddha's robe, and it's a very beautiful tradition where we take a perfectly good piece of fabric and cut it into, I think, 49 pieces, and then stitch them all back together again. And every stitch is a mantra. right? Every stitch, with every stitch you recite, Namukie Butsu, Namukie Ho, Namukie So. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And so, this is this meditative practice that you're engaged in over a very, very long period of time. And yet at the same time, it's interesting because there's this feeling of when you put on, Japanese robes in the West, there's this feeling of it being a little bit like cosplay, right? Like costume
Dress
play,
up.
right?
Yeah.
And so once again, it brings up this idea of authenticity and inauthenticity and authority too. So I mean, the hitting stick, for example, in anti-authoritarian United States doesn't go over so well.
Good point.
Right? Yeah.
Or it does, because it's the antithesis and of what people are expecting. I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one, I'm reminded of a movie from 20 years ago, How to Make an American Quilt. It sounds a little bit like the sewing aspect of it. And I think one thing, from the Japanese cultural standpoint, the doing, the polishing, the rubbing, the cleaning, it's the action, the kata, the carrying that out over and over again so it becomes second nature and you don't have to think about it. Right, is what triggers that higher realization.
I think one other point, since we're on robes, I learned from Diane Riggs, from our contributor, that this sewing process as part of your Zen practice apparently died out in Japan and is really being, in a sense, maintained only here in America, or maybe other Western Euro-American countries, I'm not sure, but that's an interesting point, I think, in and of itself as well, right? So you have this material, literally a material object made out of material, that represents the Dharma, represents the transmission, represents your own practice, and is about as intimate as you can get with yourself, right? Because it's literally part of on your body, right? And that is maybe what we're latching onto here in the States, in the Zen monastic context here, more so even than in supposedly the country of origin, right? I mean, but this is continuity and change. This happens, right? Indian dhyana is very different from Chinese Chan, which is very different from Japanese Zen, and so now American Zen is going to look very different, certainly, than Indian or Chinese or even Japanese Zen. So continuity and change. I think Ian Reader talks about the shifting sands of continuity, right? So things change.
It's sort of like a relay race, passing the staff, passing the baton from country to country, right? I was thinking, just listening to you, what you talked about, the practice in Zen of the interaction with the material world. So, for example, stitching the robe, or cleaning, which is what Paula Arai talks about, cleaning the temple with rags, and the intimacy with which you interact with the material world around you, right? In this kind of container. And I was thinking about this in reference to your article on architecture and these Japanese aesthetic terms that we're so familiar with, once again, in this country, terms like wabi-sabi, for example, or, which are all minimalist terms and have this, this kind of aesthetic appeal that, obviously we relate to Zen, right? And I was thinking about that architecturally and about how, I mean, for example, when I went to Japan, as an adult and went to a Japanese temple, I was kind of astonished that it was so elaborate. Right?
Good.
So I was hoping you could maybe talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, during the Kamakura period, so 1192 to 1333, there was, as Stephen mentioned, increasing numbers of either diplomatic missions or religious missions going back and forth between Japan and the continent, and bringing back, importing all this continental knowledge, technology, medicine, and all sorts of things, including architecture. And in fact, they called it the Karayo style. So the the style of architecture from over there, right? The Chinese style. And so all the big Zen temples in Japan, in Kamakura, which was the capital at the time, all import and this Chinese style of architecture, and it becomes all the rage. But it's not this minimalistic, maybe shoji, this kind of very simplistic or minimalistic form. It's very elaborate, very ornate. The bracketing systems itself are astounding architecturally. The article that I wrote for the book doesn't deal with that so much, but it deals with Dogen's understanding of the material theory of his day. He basically imports even that from China. So instead, and replaces a pre-existing material world premised on the 5 elements. That comes from India: earth, water, fire, air, space. And he instead is using a Chinese-derived material theory based on earth, water, fire, wood, and metal. And he talks about how he needs these, all the material and human resources to make a new Zen monastery in Japan. And so that's kind of what I was working on for this book. So it's really interesting to see how he basically riffs on the physics of his day, really, as he understood the world, to create a new kind of Zen temple in Japan, where all this authentic practice could take place.
And it's a beautiful pairing of articles too, yours and then Paula's, which is about the very meticulous care of every inch of the floorboards.
Well, one footnote is that in the early days, because they knew that some of the Chinese style would be very attractive, but sometimes it was off-putting and it could get a lot of resistance. So they might have it, but cover it up. So they might have the Chinese style paintings on the sliding doors, and then have another layer of doors covering it, so they would only reveal the inner level to the people who they thought would appreciate it.
Sure. We have 1 minute left, and I want to go back to rice cakes, okay? This is of course you're familiar with a Dogen essay, fascicle, about the rice cake, gabyo. And I'll just read the beginning of it, and I'd like to ask you to respond to it. Okay, it's once again about the question of representation. So Dogen, this is Dogen. An ancient Buddha said, "The painting of a rice cake does not satisfy hunger." This statement has been studied by ancient Buddhas and present Buddhas. Nevertheless, it has become the mere chatter of seekers in grass roof huts and under trees. If you say a painting is not real, then the myriad things are not real. If the myriad things are not real, then Buddha Dharma is not real. As Buddha Dharma is real, a painted rice cake is real. Yeah.
Well, one thing I think that a writer like Dogen has to be read aloud, and I love the way you read that. They said that when Kafka was alive, and he wanted his books burned, but and his friend didn't do it, but he would have these readings, and people would read the stuff before, and they thought this was kind of weird and dry, and then he would read it, and they would be laughing, and there's a lot of humor in Dogen when he says, "Oh, that's mindless chatter."
Chatter, right.
But we were talking before how he ends that passage, or that chapter eventually, by saying, "Only the painted rice cake." So he wants it both ways, and the illusion, and he says this about other things, like flowers in the sky, that was supposed to be cataracts or misvisions, and this is something that's positive. Dreams are also very positive. And all these things that could symbolize illusion, like the entangled vines, become vehicles. There's nothing that's not a vehicle for realization, according to Dogen.
Right. So this is an example when he's really immanentizing the Dharma, right? In anything, including an image of a painted rice cake, right? So sometimes, you have to consider the level of his audience, perhaps, or the level from which he's speaking. What plane is he talking from? Is it a very conventional level with beginner audiences, or is it, is he talking metaphysically? And so then he's kind of collapsing this bifurcated universe between dharma and real things and saying, no, a painted rice cake can be real. So sometimes he's speaking on two levels and sometimes he's collapsing. So it depends.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
answer.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, so I think we have to call it quits there, but I want to thank everybody for coming. And
you.
before your applause, let me just say that there's a reception outside in the foyer and a book signing, and you'll have more of an opportunity to talk to our wonderful guests. Thank you so much
Ruth.
for
Thank
coming.
you so
and
much.
thank you for coming
Thank
too.
you. Thank you very much.